What is a mimeograph machine? Is this something you've always been wanting to know? Well, this is it. This is a mimeograph machine. And this is a mimeograph machine in action. The mimeograph machine is what you'd call dead media. Other examples of dead media are a typewriter, a telegraph, a wooden crank telephone. Don't forget the magic lantern. You get the idea. Technology we don't use anymore. But back to the mimeograph machine. What is it? What does it do? And why should you care? Well, today's your lucky day because you're going to find out everything you've ever wanted to know about the mimeograph machine but were afraid to ask. Or perhaps more accurately, didn't know you needed to. And what's more, you're going to find out about the impact of the mimeograph machine on writing, literacy, and education. Okay, here we go. The mimeograph machine was invented by a certain someone you may have heard of before, a man by the name of Thomas Edison. Here's the handsome fellow himself. And here he is in less inspired times. You might remember he's the inventor of the, wait for it, light bulb. And the power station. Here's his first one on Pearl Street in New York City. He also recorded Mary Had a Little Lamb on the first phonograph, as well as thousands of other inventions. By this time, printing, of course, was hundreds of years old, but the tools to make copies of already printed pages were largely out of the public's grasp until good old Thomas Edison patented what he called the electric pen and duplicating press in 1876. He then proceeded to sell the patent to Alfred Blake Dick, otherwise known as A.B. Dick, who coined the term mimeograph, or mimeo, and marketed the first commercial machine to the public in 1887. The mimeograph machine process worked like this. Documents had to be prepared on a special wax-covered stencil on a typewriter which had its ribbon taken out. The typewriter then made impressions in the stencil which were filled with ink and squeezed onto paper by the mimeograph roller. The remaining purple ink is a characteristic of mimeograph. If you're over a certain age, you may remember the distinct smell coming from the papers after they've been printed. In the early to mid-20th century, nearly all needs for duplicated copy were done on the mimeograph. Throughout the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and other major changes taking place in a dynamic society, the mimeograph continued to be an office necessity. It is believed that the A.B. Dick mimeograph produced every copy of every single order of U.S. military personnel during World War I. The world was changing and demands for copies were growing. The ability to make 100 copies a minute was quite high-tech for the time. These mimeos cost between $50 and $100 in 1950, equivalent to about $500 to $1,000 in 2016. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the mimeograph machine revolutionized the way offices worked. Church offices were able to print off 100 weekly bulletins for their congregations every Sunday, which listed the order of worship for a religious service, as well as a brief summary of current news and happenings in the congregation. Schools were also aided by the use of the mimeographs, especially teachers who needed to print off class sets of quizzes and worksheets. And they were even easy enough to operate that children could help to print them off. Many other offices, who initially had to rely on making carbon copies, could now make multiple copies with ease. Within a few years, the positions of copyists and scriveners disappeared, and secretaries' roles changed drastically. But now, let's get to the real reason you're here. You're wondering why and how the invention of the mimeograph machine changed writing, literacy, and education, right? Basically, I wouldn't be exaggerating to say that there was a bit of a revolution in the arts that happened due to the invention of the mimeograph machine. It kicked in the 1950s and really took off after that. This revolution brought with it the major change that we're concerned with here, the changes to writing and literacy. This period of time came to be known as the Mimeo Revolution, which was an unbelievable outpouring of poetry, books, and magazines. Writers were experimenting with previously unwritten topics like sex, drugs, and spirituality, and they were doing it with the help of, you guessed it, the mimeograph machine. Allen Ginsberg, for example, was one such writer. He was an American poet and one of the leading figures of both the Beat generation of the 1950s and the counterculture that soon followed. He couldn't get published by most of the big-name literary magazines or presses, so poets such as him had to find other ways to reach their audience. Out of necessity, they invented their own communities and audiences with a small press or little magazines. That's where the mimeograph came in. This low-cost machine, which was a forerunner to the Xerox, sparked an explosion of these underground do-it-yourself magazines and poetry books. It was essential to a generation of artists. Mimeographed books, newsletters, and magazines had a handmade look that further set them apart from more slick mainstream publications. Many of these publications were sought out not only for their anything-goes aesthetic, but also the genuine sense of discovery they revealed. The covers were both beautiful and disturbing, and were works of art in and of themselves. Direct access to mimeograph machines made these publishing ventures possible, for the first time, putting the means of production into the hands of the poet. Now, almost anyone could become a publisher. For the price of a few pieces of paper and a handful of stencils, a poet could produce, by mimeograph, a magazine or booklet in a small edition over the course of several days. Collating, stapling, and mailing parties helped speed up production, but more significantly, they helped strengthen this group of writers. The do-it-yourself nature of mimeographs meant they could be produced by anyone, anywhere, with varying levels of sophistication, from a professional-looking magazine with well-established writers to a cheaply produced booklet filled with contributions from the aspiring and unpublished. Independent bookstores made it both easier and possible to find these publications. In some cases, the magazines were available only to a mailing list. They were produced for a community of like-minded people as a literary newsletter. It was a quick way to get your new work out. Essentially, they were on the cutting edge of new explorations of language. The fact that a mimeograph machine could produce these magazines quickly meant that writers could get quick responses to what had just been written. Not quick for 2016, mind you, but quick given the time. Clay and Phillips wrote that the books and magazines of the Mimeo Revolution appear imbued with the vivid purity of intention, which is nearly impossible to conceive of creating in today's publications. That's a pretty bold statement, which clearly shows the impact of the mimeograph machine on writing and culture during these fascinating yet tumultuous times. Publishers who had originally been ignoring these experimental poets started to take notice as Mimeo books spread. Kyle Schlesinger is a typography professor at the University of Houston, Victoria, an expert on this Mimeo movement. He says that DIY publishing worked as a big feeding tube into what would eventually become mainstream writing. Robert Creeley, a friend of Allen Ginsberg and another American poet, originally started in self-publishing, but a well-known firm, Scribner's, eventually picked him up. Scribner's was known for publishing authors such as Ernest Hemingway and Kurt Vonnegut. It's not too hard to see how mimeograph presses fostered some of the most culturally important writers in the mid-20th century. To wrap up, yes, mimeographs are indeed dead media, but just like the 8-track, the cassette, and the Sony Walkman, they are an important part of our literary culture. In fact, should you care to learn more about the mimeograph machine, you'll need to search no further than your social media. Check out the Facebook Mimeo users group, as well as the mimeograph hashtag on Twitter, where you can see a variety of interesting old mimeograph machines, as well as innovative new printmaking done on these old relics.